today with Matt Pride. Matt, you want to give us a brief introduction to yourself and to your work?
Sure, Johann. And I just want to express my gratitude to you for inviting me onto the show to share my story. So I currently serve on active duty as a U.S. Army military officer. I teach military science at City College of New York, which is a public university under the City University of New York system. I actually direct ROTC for the U.S. Army Cadet Command for the entire system of City University of New York, which consists of 25 university and colleges. And any graduate or undergrad student that is enrolled in any one of the 25 university or colleges within CUNY who aspire to become an officer will take electives at City College. And I oversee that program, the staff and instruction, the curriculum, all of the personnel that are cadets that will aspire to become officers. I oversee that program for Cadet Command. I've been there for 18 months now, and it's a real honor and pleasure because I'm originally from New York. So in large part, I'm back serving the community which invested in me when I first started on my path to become an officer. So that's just a little bit about who I am and what it is that I do.
What's the most difficult thing you've had to do in the armed services?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. And of course, combat deployments have been a real challenge for me. But what I think has been sort of my story or my journey is a deep inquiry into what is leadership. The question about leadership comes up often. It's when I'm a young 22-year-old placed in a unit preparing for a combat deployment to Iraq and being told that you are the leader, you're the one that your soldiers will look to direct you, to direct them, to guide them, to inspire them. You take real pause, at least I took real pause to answer that question for myself, what is leadership? And having been a graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point, New York, we're instructed well in what leadership is. However, not many experts will take the time to actually answer that question in a way that I found sufficient. So that was, so for me, it was combat deployment was some of the hardest things that I've had to do. But it's not just simply the experience of combat as much as it is the responsibility of being a leader and understanding what that means.
Before we get into your vision of leadership, what was the most dangerous or difficult situation you were in?
Yeah, so I was very fortunate in my combat experiences. I spent 15 months in Iraq. I spent the majority of my time in northern Iraq. I was an engineer commissioned to the engineer corps, and I spent my time as not as a combat engineer, but as a construction engineer. So there's really two sides to the engineering mission. I serviced the side of construction. So we were primarily responsible for restoring roadways after the bombing took place. We were responsible for restoring the airfield after indirect fire came in and destroyed many of the airstrips. We were responsible for erecting buildings that were unfortunately demolished as a result of either combat activity or terrorist activity that took place there within those countries. And so I was really more on the construction side after what we call the kinetics or the actual combat roles were being done. And then I spent 9 months in Afghanistan. For me, the most dangerous though is indirect fire. Indirect fire is when you have insurgent actors, bad actors outside the forward operating base will shoot the indirect fire munitions a distance away, and then the rounds would fall into the actual forward operating base where soldiers were typically recovering from missions. They were housing, they were going to deep dining facilities to eat, and these rounds would come in. And unfortunately, while very early one morning, a detonation occurred in the building next to where I was, and all the sirens and all the warnings went off. My soldiers were supposed to run to a bunker, but as we exited the building, we noticed that they were injured who needed to be administered care. And typically we're supposed to move to a bunker location where we could be protected from further indirect fire. But my soldiers, especially my medics, rather than seeking to cover, to provide for their own safety, ran to the shouts and the screams of those that were in need. And we were able to administer life-saving care, and to allow for those soldiers to be brought to the next level of care. So that indirect situation is one that brought me the closest to that point of mortality where I felt like it very well could be my time, so to speak. But aside from that, Johann, I'll tell you, I'm very fortunate that I didn't have many of the same experiences many of my peers did, who were in direct combat. We were always the ones that were restoring roadways, rebuilding buildings, which I thought was a really important aspect to the mission as well.
How many people were under your leadership?
I went over with 42 soldiers who were part of my platoon, and then I was eventually promoted into an executive officer position for the company that I was assigned to, which was about 120 soldiers. And that was at the very beginning. I mean, we're talking a year after graduating from West Point, 22 years old, married, with the wife who, by the point that I was deployed, I had spent more time away from than with. So it was pretty remarkable.
It's surreal to be in charge of so many people so soon. I know that feeling of not thinking maybe imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
So let's get into now, but you pulled it off, Ben. So let's get into what is your vision for leadership?
Yeah, it's a big question. There are somewhere in the ballpark of as many definitions of leadership as there are people who attempt to answer that question. Something like 45 or 50 different models that are promoted. Actually, the leadership consultancy industry is somewhere in a ballpark of $381 billion. And it's fascinating to me that as I encounter various different definitions and explanations and descriptions and models of leadership, that there really are thousands of ways people interpret what it is that two people do when they find themselves in an endeavor or in an enterprise or undertaking a goal or a challenge. For me, the question of what is leadership was most profoundly answered when I converted to Catholicism, because what I sensed as a soldier and what I sensed through my instruction in the military, and quite often the example of good leaders that I experienced and then bad leadership that I experienced, and trying to work through the different theories behind what it was that my own experience told me about leadership, it really didn't unlock for me until I converted to Catholicism and finally found a vocabulary and a rich intellectual tradition that provided a comprehensive and integrated answer to the question. And the answer is not a Catholic answer, and it's not a Christian answer. It's leadership for leadership's sake. It is what leadership is. And so what I found is that leadership is when one person uses power provided to them by another to direct others to pursue goods esteemed by those united in a common purpose. And by that, I mean a complete definition that, if you're familiar at all with the Aristotelian four causes, Aristotle posited that there are four causes that give rise to or define on necessary and sufficiently anything that exists. The efficient cause, the final cause, the material cause, and the formal cause. And using the four causes that Aristotle posited 2,500 years ago, that was incorporated into the Catholic intellectual tradition through many philosophers and theologians, principally among them, of course, St. Thomas Aquinas. The definition that I just gave to you satisfies, it's sufficient, and it provides all the necessary conditions for what leadership is. But more simply speaking, the animating principle, what gives the essential composition to leadership, is nothing other than love, which is shocking. It's something that I know will not be received well by ears that understand love to be something that's a feeling, a really intense, intimate feeling between lovers. In some cases, psychologized lust in many instances, as Peter Kreeft once put it. But in the Catholic intellectual tradition, love is something fundamental. It is the animating principle to the cosmos. It is the very essence of God. And for me, in my military service, I discovered love is when you will the good of another for their sake, for no other sake, but for their sake. The stories of the Medal of Honor recipients, time and again, when you hear why they did what they did, you discover they were motivated by love. And that's not me looking at their experiences and imposing my Christian views on them. This is coming from them, their words, their stories. What motivated their action is love. And what I believe is the animating principle of leadership is love. And that can be shown, I believe, in incorporating the four causes and defining leadership in a way that provides a sufficient and necessary definition.
So what are the implications of that vision of leadership?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So the implications of that is when you have two individuals, two human beings that are put together in relationship, in large part because we can't get away from relationships. Humans are by definition social animals, right? That's very early in Aristotle. It is adopted by the Christian tradition. By that, we mean that we're rational, that we're social, and in certain instances, in a small p sense, political in that we're building community. And so if we're born to be in relationship and communion with one another, necessarily one will have excellence in some skill or some ability or a capacity that another lacks. And the humility for the one who lacks that skill to be brought under the mastership or under the rule of or under the charge of one that is a master or does have a capacity to share. And the one with that ability shares that capacity with the one that's less able in order to elevate that one into excellence, human excellence, in order to elevate that one into human perfection. That is leadership. It is when one directs another to acquire a good of soul, a good of bodily need, to direct another to pursue a good that is esteemed by those united in a common purpose. So the implications are profound. If we understand our actions as motivated, the animating principle of our action is to will the good of another for their sake, and we exert our energies in directing that one to pursue a good, and they acquire that good, then in order to elevate them, then the implication of that is profound. We renew the world in many instances by sharing and elevating individuals into human excellence. And just another word, Johann, because it's not just the leader who receives a gift from another so that they can pass it on to those that are under their charge, but the follower or the one that's less able needs to understand the virtue of obedience. The virtue of obedience that is explained by Thomas Aquinas in question 104 of the second part of the Summa, where he goes through and speaks how obedience is a special virtue in particular, because it requires, as a species of justice, it requires the one who must be obedient to have the virtue to open themselves up, to receive that gift, to be trained and incorporated into the tradition and the wisdom, and then to be elevated to a point where they then elevate others or help to direct others to also partake in that same good, that same excellence, that same perfection. And I think this is where we get leadership very wrong today. I think that we treat leadership as a commodity. We treat it as a tool to impose a will, usually the will of those who are stronger on those who are weaker, in order to produce, in order to be more efficient, in order to drive profit, in order to gain growth, which are treated as ends. And I think I'm very troubled by the way that we use leadership in order to achieve personal gain, which is a form of tyranny, as opposed to using leadership for the sake of elevating others into human excellence. I think that's the difference between a good leader and a manager. A good leader, you're
Exactly.
moved. You're moved. A good manager just produces, and they get praise and promote it, but good leaders move others, and that term "moved" is analogous. It's an analogical term. It's something that a person is elevated into an excellence. I
And
can go
Cynic.
on and on. I'm sorry, Johan. This is
Yeah, for sure. You're doing
right.
good.
Yeah,
Simon Sinek has a great explanation of the leadership versus manager dichotomy on his YouTube video on empathy. It's a great explanation. I'm going to give you a definition of leadership, and here I want to hear your input on it. A leader brings out the best in others for the good of the team.
yeah, yeah. So a leader brings out the best in others for the good of the team. Yeah, I would have to say that provides a good it provides a sufficient answer to what is leadership. I'm concerned that the good of the team can sometimes be misused. It could sometimes lead. So, for instance, in certain political contexts, right, and there's a dilemma that every leader encounters when they try to define leadership. The dilemma is Hitler, right? The question is,
Like, was he a good leader?
was Hitler a good leader? Um, and so when you're looking at the context of the team and what the team is oriented around, and whether that team in a context of competition, whether they're able to achieve their goal for their own sake, can sometimes it it's agnostic of moral virtue, right? It's agnostic of the need for there to be some guiding principle behind that which is actually good for the team. And what I'm concerned about is that you could take a definition that's very simply put, and you could, if it doesn't have the content that helps to direct others towards something that is um, grounded on moral foundation, that is grounded on some sort of ethical framework, that it can then be extracted for different purposes. As long as the team is achieving its goal and the leader is helping them to do so, then I think you can define whatever that good is to be, whatever the team decides that it is. So I think it does provide a sufficient, what you just gave as a definition provides a sufficient definition. But there are certain elements of it that I find necessary to leadership to ensure the Hitler dilemma, or the evolved ape dilemma. And by that I mean, if we treat humans as as just material beings with that's no different than animals, then we'll say things like, look at other social communities that are in the animal kingdom, and we can extrapolate leadership lessons from them and then apply that to humans. I think that effort can lead to some really troubling findings. And I'm happy to, and I'm working on a lot of this to put it into sort of like a manuscript of some type to really share some of my concerns when I speak that. But just simply put, that's something that I would share.
Yeah, it sounds like you're highlighting the distinction between the true good and the perceived good or apparent good.
No, that's
And,
exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
okay. Well, I'm glad you didn't totally destroy the definition, because I spent years thinking about that one. So, but it's an important
That's
clarification.
good.
So,
Was it your definition?
yeah, I spent a lot of time thinking about what is leadership, and
Yeah.
I've adapted the definition over time. But yeah, many hours studying this and experimenting with it, working with it. So,
Yeah. Yeah. No, yeah, it is important. And I don't know if you're familiar with Alexander Hubbard. He has a virtuous leadership system. I know your podcast, Virtuous Leaders. There's some parallel in there, and certainly, um, there is the need for humans to be virtuous in order to lead others into goods of the soul. And I think virtue is an essential quality and trait of good leaders. And so the idea of bringing out the excellence in others in order to achieve a common good for the team, I think is at the basis of what it takes to lead. One area that I want to ensure that we capture in there is that a lot of times we draw a box around the follower and the leader, and we examine the leader and we look at all the traits necessary for the leader to do all the activities to be successful. Then we look at the follower and look at what the follower needs to do. And then maybe we might include in there the goals or the context that leadership has to emerge. And we'll just simply explore that, and we'll do experiments and everything else. Where I'm concerned is that we lose sight of the fact that that there's a tradition or an authority that allows the leader, that gives the leader the capacity to act, because leaders can't give what they don't have or what they haven't received from another. And when we look at leaders who act for themselves, the reality is no one's really doing anything in a vacuum. Like, my ability as a military officer to be effective within the context of military service, in large part, is the UCMJ, the Uniform Code of Military Justice. There is a compliancy that comes along with that structure, but that in and of itself isn't leadership. But there is a reality that there's some tradition behind which I act, that there are those that I learned, a trade that I learned, that gives me the capacity, the authority, that gives me I hope the wisdom to be able to act responsibly with the charge that I have. And so that's why I feel the definition that that I've developed incorporates that authority or that power base from another, and power not for the sake of imposing will, but power from the sake of building capacity, of building of ability. It takes into account a much larger, context of three persons as opposed to just two people, follower and leader. There's now a third, which is the tradition or the authority figure that gives the authority or the power to the other.
Let's hear your definition one more time.
Yeah. So my definition is that leadership is a human act, by which one exercises power provided by another to direct others to pursue a good esteemed by those united in common purpose without regard for self. So it's a human act. Okay. That's the material cause, by which one exercises the power provided by another. That's the efficient act. That's the efficient cause, sorry. To direct others to pursue a good, esteemed by those united in common purpose. That's the final cause. Without regard for self. That's that provides the essential definition of the formal cause, because it's necessary for the leader to act without regard for self. It can't be about the leader. It can't be about what it is that the individual gains by directing another to pursue that good. So by identifying it as a human act, and there is a tradition behind human acts that's provided by, in the Summa, there's, it's got to be voluntary and it's got to be rational, right? But leadership is a human act, and it involves the efficient cause of receiving power and capacity by another to direct others to pursue a good esteemed by those united in a common purpose without regard for self. That is a sufficient animating principle, and I believe that is love. What I just explained to you, leadership is love. It's directed another. It's using the gifts that have been given to you to direct others to pursue a good for their sake and without regard for self. Sacrificing, service-based, and just giving entirely of yourself. That's what the military tradition has taught me. That's what I learned in my conversion to the Catholic faith, and realizing this great, rich tradition that's been handed down by generations. And that's what inspires me now to continue serving, is that when I walk into a room and a junior officer stands up at the position of attention and we both sit down at the table, And then we start a meeting and the junior officer is provided information to me that I didn't know. In that moment, that junior officer is leading me and I'm obedient and listening to what he's saying because he's sharing something to me that's going to move me into a closer relationship with him. And so leadership isn't a position. It's not a title. It's not oftentimes, it's not even something that's structural. It's when someone is more excellent at a good, comes into a relationship with one less excellent at a good, and then you, for the sake of that individual, you elevate them into human perfection and excellence. Does that make sense?
It's a very thoughtful definition. Beautiful.
Thank you.
I wonder if you're willing to share a little bit about your conversion story.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really great story. I was raised non-denominational Protestant. I met my wife in between my junior and my senior year at West Point. She was working at the U.S. Embassy in Paris, France, and I was with a group of cadets and at a military unit in Germany, Kaiserslautern in Germany. For the summer, I was there for 30 days, learning the ins and outs of becoming a second lieutenant and being assigned to a unit. A mutual friend introduced us in front of Notre Dame in Paris, France, and that's where I met her. She had only converted a year prior to Catholicism, and I frankly didn't know very much about the faith at all. But we started dating. She took her faith very seriously, and eventually, a year after we met, we ended up marrying at West Point, and I married into the faith. And for me, because I didn't really understand Catholicism very well at all, and I wasn't introduced to it as a young person. I didn't really know very many Catholics, or at least it wasn't apparent to me that they were Catholic, or that there was any distinction between the denominations. So this was really my first encounter with the faith in any substantial way. And I really struggled with it because the church in our infinite wisdom requires those that are in irregular marriages. She was Catholic, I was not Catholic, but she was confirmed and baptized. I was baptized as well as a Christian. So we were married in the church, but because I was not Catholic, I had to agree to marry, to raise our children Catholic. So suddenly I had this tension where I had to instruct and raise our children in a faith that I did not embrace myself. And that created a contradiction that I needed to reconcile. So I struggled with the decision on whether to, but I made this oath and I agreed to it. So I spent the first 5 to 6 years of our marriage just deeply researching and exploring the faith for the purposes of trying to undermine it, out of a hope that perhaps I would be able to convert our family back to what I thought was our roots. Like my wife is Protestant, I was Protestant, and I thought that was the roots of our family. And then I kept running into roadblocks, which I thought were my own intellectual abilities or my own training and understanding. And so I would pick up an issue, I would examine it, I would come to unsatisfactory answers, and I'd put it down, and then I'd explore another topic and another topic. Eventually, after about 6 to 8 years, I realized that it wasn't that I was untrained or unskilled; it was that I was wrong. And so for me, it was really coming to and more than just the argument itself, Johann, it was the beautiful witness and sacrifices of my wife and her patience. And it was other good Catholics witnessing by their example, and great priests that we ran into who modeled the faith very excellently, that led me to embrace the faith. And that conversion, that paradigm shift for me, what helped give rise to this definition of leadership as well, because they each led me into a higher state of excellence and being that I needed to obey. I eventually had to obey what the Lord had placed into my heart. And in doing so, I did it in 2014. So I just celebrated 10 years of Catholic.
Congrats.
Back in 2024. Yeah.
Beautiful. Beautiful, man. Any particular resources that stood out as helpful for you during that time?
Yeah. For me, I was led by truth into goodness, into beauty. And the truth of the faith, the logical consistency of the Catholic faith, both the external historical consistency and the internal logical consistency, I really found beautiful. Of course, all the popular books that are available today and many of the podcasts and talks that were produced predominantly by the St. Paul's Center for Biblical Theology, the writings of Scott Hahn and John Bergsma, Jeff Morrow, these guys really presented a deep and truthful and I thought logical argument for why the Catholic faith was true. They helped me encounter the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas, who is my confirmation saint. He helped the way that he structured his arguments. I thought were very helpful. A lot of people are find them very difficult and can struggle with them, and I did as well. And I worked through them very patiently, very humbly, under the guidance of many of the speakers that I told you about, different podcasts, the Thomistic Institute. And then from there, I realized how good the faith was, which provided for its beauty to inspire me, the different arts and the work and the history, the church structures. That all is sort of like my entry into the church. So it wasn't one argument, but for me, it was the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas, many of the popular speaker and apologists that are available today, but chiefly among them, anyone connected to the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology that is provided by Dr. Scott Hahn, and his whole, the whole group of what they're doing has been incredibly helpful. So I hope that was maybe a little helpful for your viewers and listeners to understand the path that I took.
Well, welcome to the truth. I'm glad you're here.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. Thank you. And if you don't mind, I should probably also add that while I serve on active duty and I made that a big part of my story, my views don't represent the Department of the Army, the Department of Defense, the United States government, the executive branch. These are views that I arrived at personally through my journey. I do in fact believe I do in fact believe them to be true and consistent with my experience and with reality. But I just have to throw in that disclaimer.
Sure. Well, to the Virtuous Leaders audience, I want to highlight one aspect which Matt hasn't made directly explicit, but the importance of the virtue of study for a leader, the intellectual formation, and how that is the foundation then of guiding others to excellence. Matt, you have a great definition of leadership, and you instantiate it in your own life, leading so many people. I wish you all the best with that. If you liked this episode, share it, like it, subscribe, and give us your feedback on what you think leadership is or what you learned from this. Matt, thank you for joining.
Yeah, thank you very much, John. It was a pleasure.